into Romans. Last week I introduced this letter that Rob Shaul, the Apostle Paul, wrote to a bunch of believers living in Rome. And I mentioned a couple of things I want to just remind you of. This is the longest letter that Paul wrote, and it's in the front of the New Testament after Acts, in case you can't find it. But it's kind of peculiar because the book of Acts is a transition book between the Jewish people and then the message getting out to the known world and to the Gentile world. And here comes Romans. Before we talked about Romans, you remember what I talked about a couple of months ago? We did this little routine last week. You remember that letter I mentioned? Galatians, you remember that? Well, I think you do. Galatians addressed a problem that was taking place in Asia Minor. Can I have that map up there now? That was happening was that there were many, many non-Jews who were choosing to follow the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob through the Messiah, Yeshua. And yet, there were some people that started to teach them that they needed to also keep the Torah for salvation. And I tried to make the point last week. Here's, where are we here? There we go. There's Galatia. It's a big territory. And we know that Paul traveled to Antioch and he was in Syria and Damascus. You read all about all these cities in the New Testament. But he spent a lot of time here reaching these people for the Messiah. But he had in mind going to someplace else. How about the next map? Okay. So he's over here now, but his goal is ultimately to go to, back a map. There we go, right there. Hispania, which is Spain. He had a vision to cover this whole area, the whole Mediterranean Sea. He didn't know about Canada, he didn't know about America, so to him that was the whole world. They didn't know much more than that. And he wanted to take care of the situation in Galatia first, but he knew he had to go next to Italy to speak to the Romans. Italy's right here, and there's Rome. So he made his way over here, he stopped off in here, wrote a few letters, and we're going to pick it up now in the letter to the Romans. Keep in mind, I said the letter to the Romans because it was a letter. It was not a doctrinal treatise, it wasn't a doctoral dissertation, it wasn't a master's thesis. It was a letter that he wrote to the believers in Rome. Let me introduce it to you with a few words from a book by Mark Nanos, who did an excellent job explaining a lot about Rome, the Romans. Paul sets out in Romans, strikingly and in no uncertain terms, that the very purpose of his apostleship to the Gentiles is in the service of Israel's restoration. Let me repeat that. It's a very important concept to get. And sadly, most Christians have no concept of this, but you are a different group of people. Paul sets out in Romans in no uncertain terms that the purpose of his apostleship, his calling in life, is to the Gentiles in the service of Israel's restoration. He does not believe that Israel has rejected the good news totally, although he admits that they have stumbled. But he does not see Israel cast off forever, as many Christian denominations have been teaching for the last 2,000 years, which has led to tremendous amounts of awful stuff, namely 6 million Jews being murdered in Germany, as an example. On the contrary, in spite of how circumstances may presently appear, through Paul's apostolic ministry, God is demonstrating the irrevocable priority of Israel in the faithful fulfillment of his promises to the fathers. And you all know the promise to the fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that through Israel he would bless the entire world. That's the plan. That's the plan. For Paul, then, the pattern of salvation history has been and always will be, even in the midst of confronting misguided exclusivity on the part of some of the children of Jacob, to the Jew first and also to the Gentile, which is the title of my message today. To the Jew first and also to the Gentile, also to the Greek. Clearly, although the apostle has a deep understanding of the relationship between his people Israel and the many Gentiles who have been coming to faith, as we learned from our study of Galatians, he believed that Gentiles did not have to keep the Torah to be super saved. They were saved by trust in the same God that Abraham Avinu, our father Abraham, followed. The faith was considered sufficient for salvation. The way we are saved, the way we are made righteous with God, is through our trust in Yeshua's work. Do we all know that? Do we all accept that? Do we all believe that? There's more to it, but that's the beginning part. But we're going to see in the letter to the Romans, there's a lot more going on. Now remember, he wrote Galatians from Galatia first. He was dealing with an issue there. Now he's writing to the Romans because he's coming for a visit to help straighten out some of the problems that they were having. So the letter begins from Shaul, or Paul. Paulos is not really his name. Some people have said that when Shaul or Saul became a believer, God changed his name to Paul. Have you ever heard that? No, that's not what happened. He was still Shaul. When he went home from Hanukkah, his mother said something about Shaul. Didn't say anything about Paul, okay? He was still Shaul, Saul. It was a common practice throughout history that Jewish people have two names, a Hebrew name and a name that's more common in the country in which they live. My Hebrew name, as an example, is Baruch. You know what Baruch means, right? Blessed. Blessed. But my first name that I've gone by most of my life is Barry. I kind of like Baruch. I am Baruch ben Israel. My father's name is Israel. Baruch ben Israel, blessed son of Israel. And since I've met the Messiah, I can accept that. Well, another commentator says that Paul might be a family name, but I don't think that's the case. He goes on and says, a slave of the Messiah Yeshua, an emissary, an apostle, a shaliach, a sent one, an agent, a representative, because I was called and set apart for the good news of God. There he's referencing Isaiah 40 through Isaiah 66, which speaks of Zion's rescue from exile. This whole concept of salvation has its root and foundation in God's treatment of Israel. So to ignore that is not getting the full impact of what salvation is all about. He calls himself a slave or a bondservant. Now let me explain something to you. He's not talking about himself as a Roman slave, although there were plenty of Roman slaves, and many Jews were enslaved to Rome. He's using the concept from a Torah expression called Ebed Yahweh, or a servant of the Lord, a servant of the Most High. All the prophets were known as servants of God, Ebed Yahweh. And that's what Paul's relating to, because he's seeing this all in his own Jewish perspective. And that's the way it was meant to be, because the whole Bible is meant to be understood from a Jewish perspective. So God promised this good news in advance through his prophets in the Tanakh, he says. It concerns his son. He is descended from David physically. He was powerfully demonstrated to be the Son of God spiritually, set apart by his having been resurrected from the dead. He is Yeshua, the Messiah, our Lord. Remember, this is all part of his introduction, his salutation to the Romans. It's rather long because he doesn't know these people very well. He goes on to say in another letter, 1 Corinthians, for I have delivered to you as of first importance that which I also received, the Messiah died for our sins according to the Scripture, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. What Scriptures? There were no scriptures in those days except the Tanakh. The New Testament did not exist. There were no scriptures. So he's saying here in his letter to the Corinthians that according to the Tanakh, the scriptures, it must have been predicted that the Messiah would come and die and be buried and be raised from the dead. And this is subtly throughout the entire Tanakh, and in some places it's more obvious. We'll have to pick up that a little bit later on in a study of Messianic prophecy. But this message of resurrection is critical to the message of the salvation of all people, Jew and Gentile. Unfortunately, too often, I must say that Christians come to the conclusion about the Messiah only from reading the New Testament. They often say the Old Testament is old, no worth looking at. It's old, it's finished. Might as well die. Let's stick with the New Testament. And they cut off 90% of the Bible, 80% of the Bible. Thankfully, we don't do that here because we need the background, we need the context of it if we're going to truly understand what's happening. And Yeshua's resurrection of the dead is the first fruits of God's ultimate resurrection of all human beings in the last days. It seems that Paul wanted to place the New Testament gospel clearly in the midst of a full message of salvation given to Israel, especially as expressed by the prophet Yeshayahu, Isaiah. One New Testament professor, Doug Moo, who actually I had a class on New Testament in seminary a few decades ago, Doug Moo wrote these words: "The transition is not a transition from a human Messiah to a divine Son of God, but from the Son as Messiah to the Son as both Messiah and powerful reigning Lord. The resurrection proved this transition and authenticated Yeshua's ruling authority." The resurrection is a key aspect of our faith. If you don't believe in the resurrection, if you don't accept that Yeshua was raised from the dead, I question your faith. The resurrection is vital, it's central to everything that happens, because if he did not rise from the dead, it's all in vain, as Paul writes in another place. In a sense, it's the same for us. We are sons and daughters of God by virtue of his choosing us, but we still have to grow in that role. Yeshua was always the Son of God, but when he came to earth and was resurrected, it was the beginning of his fulfilling his role as the Son of God. It's like being saved, I've shared with you, is step number one, and we didn't do anything to be saved except trust that God rescued us. But step number two and further is sanctification, growing in the Lord, how to be set apart, how to be sanctified, how to be made more like God. And that's what we're all about today. We're all saved by faith through Yeshua's sacrifice. Now the problem and challenge comes to us to be sanctified, to grow in this. You know, in a sense, we admire people, don't we, who have inherited wealth and power that use it for good. We like those people. You know, they've got everything, but yet they use what God has given them, or they inherited from their families. They use it for good. We don't like people that disdain or squander the gifts that God has given them. This is a challenge to us here to confirm more fully to the ways of God. The message is that Yeshua did what he was called to do. He did come to earth, which was no picnic. When you're living in the heavenlies, streets of gold, you know the story. When you're living that kind of life, and then you have to come to earth, it's not a picnic. But he fulfilled his role, and when he was immersed, to begin his ministry, he began to grow more and more in his human way. A lot is written on this verse, chapter 1, verse 5, but I'm going to conclude this by quoting from a guy I like, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a Christian who sacrificed his life for his faith, but he wrote these words: And I want you to listen to it because it's so true. Only he who believes is obedient, and only he who is obedient believes. Salvation and sanctification, as I've been saying for months, go together. So verse 7, Paul says, to all those in Rome whom God loves, he wants to make it clear that he understands who they are, who have been called, who have been set apart for him. These are the people who have been saved, been born again. He says, grace to you and shalom from God our Father and the Lord Yeshua the Messiah. First, I thank my God through Yeshua for all of you, because the report of your trust, your faith, is spreading throughout the world. It's interesting. Here he spent a lot of time in Galatia, right? And now he's hearing somehow about these wonderful Roman believers who seem to be living godly and spiritual lives. He's heard about them, but he wants to bring some more information to them. So he says, for God, verse 9, whom I serve in my spirit by spreading the good news about his Son, is my witness that I regularly remember you in my prayers. And I always pray that somehow now or in the future I might, by God's will, succeed in coming to visit you. For I long to see you so that I might share with you some spiritual gift that can make you stronger. Or put it another way, so that by being with you, we might, through the faith we share, encourage one another. He has not met many of these people, and yet he writes this letter as if they were his best friends. I want to come visit you. I want to get together. I want to hang out, because by doing so, we'll strengthen each other. We'll encourage one another. You see this? Paul sees the benefit of being with other believers and getting strength from that relationship. I will make a point. It's like coming to services. The Bible says, do not forsake the assembling with believers in Hebrews, and it's a message that we need to recall. We are encouraged and strengthened by getting together. You may not like my messages. You may not even like anybody in here, but getting together with spiritual people is a way to strengthen your faith and give you encouragement. I'm being facetious. We need one another is the message. That's what Paul is saying. We need one another. And my friends, we need each other, especially as the days go on into the last days. We need each other. Brothers, I want you to know that although I've been prevented from visiting you until now, he said. Why would he be prevented from visiting? Where was he? Where has he been? He spent years in Galatia, remember? That's what's prevented him from coming. He had other work to do. But in his mind, he always intended to go to Italy. On his way to Italy over here, on his way to Rome. Then he would have fulfilled his purpose to reach all the Gentiles, at least preach to all the Gentiles in the known world. He had a lot to finish up, so that prevented him from coming to Rome. He says, I have often planned to do this in order that I might have some fruit among you, just as I have among the other Gentiles. I owe a debt to both civilized Greeks and uncivilized people, to both educated and ignorant. Therefore, I am eager to proclaim the good news to you who live in Rome. Once again, he reminds us of his sacred calling to be a proclaimer to both Jews and non-Jews. In other words, to all humanity. Then he hits the theme of this entire letter. Listen carefully. He says, for I am not ashamed of the good news, since it is God's powerful means of bringing salvation to everyone who keeps on trusting, to the Jew first, or to the Jew especially, but equally to the Gentile. Now that sounds a little rough to the ears, doesn't it? Is Paul discriminating against Gentiles? Not at all. He spent most of his early career in Galatia among Gentiles. And I've told you many times, if it were me, I would have trouble with that, because where would I get a good bagel? You know, in Galatia, they didn't have good bagels in Galatia. It wasn't a Jewish world. But Paul, who was a trained rabbi, an Orthodox religious Jew, and observed all the laws, he probably put on tefillin in the morning, phylacteries, and he davened, he prayed every 3 times a day. He had to spend all this time in the world of the Gentiles, and I don't think it thrilled him, but he did it. But he reminds them that, in this expression to the Jew first, that he also went to the Gentiles. Yet his heart was for his own people. And to the Jew first is an expression that he wrote. It demonstrates a preference in his mind to go to the Jewish community in first. I don't have time to read these verses with you, but if you're taking notes, write these verses down. You can look them up later. I'll summarize what they are. Acts 13:5 and 14, Acts 14:1, Acts 17:2, Acts 18:4, Acts 19:8. The scholar Craig Keener, based on those verses, and if you read them, you're going to find out that those are Paul's travels to different cities in the Mediterranean area. And every time he goes to a new town, where does he go first? To the synagogues. But he's the apostle to the Gentiles. Yes, but he always goes to the Jew first. It's a principle of evangelism. Craig Keener writes, Paul's evangelistic polarization of ethnic Israel fits Yeshua's teaching as well, and the portrayal of Paul's own ministry. Yet he will argue that God saves both Jews and Gentiles by the same means. Even though he went to the Jews first, he preached the same gospel to both Jews and Gentiles. Salvation is the same for Jews as it is for Gentiles. We're all saved by the same method that God provided, Jewish or Gentile. That does not mean you can't have a preference. A friend of mine has a congregation that's that's next to a college campus. He would say, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God unto salvation to everyone who believes, to the college students first, and then everybody else. Because that's his heart, that's his calling. And that's what Paul was trying to say here in Romans 1:16. Joe Shulam, who leads a congregation in the heart of Jerusalem, and if you ever go to Israel, you should go to visit his congregation. It's right in downtown Jerusalem. If we ever go, we'll stop in and see. Joe writes, Paul states the main theme of this whole letter, God's wisdom is his purpose to redeem the whole world through his own people, Israel, to whom belongs the adoption as sons and the glory and the covenants and the giving of the Torah and the temple service and the promises, whose are the fathers and from whom is the Messiah. That's a quote from later in Romans chapter 9. The people of Israel are the bearers of God's promise to Abraham that in him all the nations of the world would be blessed. Genesis 12:2, we studied that. Genesis 18:18, Genesis 22:18, repeated promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that through their descendants all the world would be blessed. Yeshua is the fulfillment of God's promises, since he is the righteousness of God. He has broken down the middle wall of partition and hostility, Ephesians 2:12, and thus provided a way for God to make Gentiles part of the commonwealth of Israel. The nations will then turn Israel back to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob by provoking them to jealousy through their service to him, following Israel's temporary rejection of God's Messiah. We're going to read about that in Romans 11. So this is all setting up what's coming. Paul's going to give us the sweep of salvation in the letter to the Romans. For in it is revealed, Mark Nanos writes, for in it is revealed how God makes people righteous in his sight, and from beginning to end it's through trust. It's through trust, and Paul quotes, the person who is righteous will live his life by trust. However, we understand from verse 17, it's clear that we need to have activated faith, living trust, living faith in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and his anointed one, Yeshua the Messiah. In the remaining portion of this chapter, which I'm not going to get into, Paul covers a lot of bad behavior that was taking place in that day. People were discounting God, they were disbelieving in God, and it was manifested by their perverse sexual behavior. If you want to read about whether homosexuality is a good alternative lifestyle, read Romans, the latter part of Romans. It is not an alternative lifestyle, it's an aberrant lifestyle. Although today in our world, it's almost seen as an acceptable lifestyle. I was watching a TV program recently, and a news commentator who I've seen on there many times before, just casually dropped. He said, well, I'm going to be having a gay wedding soon. So casual. A generation ago, people recognized that homosexuality was a sin, a really horrible sin. But now it's becoming commonplace. Well, Paul speaks to this very early here in Romans. For ever since the creation of the universe, his invisible qualities, both his eternal power and his divine nature, have been clearly seen because they can be understood from what he has made. In other words, you can't deny God's presence by looking with your eyes at what he has made. It's like this, and I think this will help us appreciate what Paul is saying here. When an artist takes time to explain his or her painting, or when a poet explains a poem to us, or when an architect explains how and why he or she built the building the way he or she did. A person who doesn't appreciate what they're looking at, but denigrates and destroys the credibility of that creator, is just doing a wrong thing. It'd be like you see a beautiful painting that somebody did, and they take the time to explain why they did it this way, why they did it that way. Or an architect builds a building and they explain why they used one material over here and some material over here. And they're trying to share with you what they created so you have appreciation for it. And what's happening is, if you don't listen and learn and respect that creator, you disdain and diminish the importance of that creator. And you really break a relationship with the creator. Can you imagine? Somebody takes the time to take you and explains to you a song. Now, I don't know too much about classical music. I was raised in the 50s and 60s, and to me, classical music was just not something I had any interest in at all. Lately, though, I've been listening to classical music on radio because it's much more calming than listening to the news. And sometime on this one station, I think it's called WGMS, they'll explain a piece of music, and it makes sense to me. Now I understand why the composer of that song or that music did it the way he did. And I am beginning to have what's called music appreciation. And as I listen more and learn more about music, I can appreciate more classical music. Same with a painting. Sometimes you can go to the Museum of what's it called, Modern Art in New York. You can walk around and see these fantastic paintings. I've done that, and I look at the painting. I have no idea what to look at because I don't know what the painting is, what the artist did. But if you put on one of those earphones, you get a guided tour, and then you learn about the artist, not just the painting. That's appreciation of art. It's not enough to just appreciate the painting itself. We need to appreciate the painter himself. Same with God. It's not an issue of us hurting God's feelings if we don't appreciate what he has given us in the creation and also the way to live in the creation, namely the Torah. It doesn't hurt his feelings. We can talk like that, and maybe it does, but I don't know if God has those kind of feelings for us. Excuse me. Cough drop, excuse me. think about it this way. If we don't learn the ways of God, the ways of His creation, we lose out. Yeah, we could be emotional and say, well, we're hurting our Father's feelings. I know that may be true. But think what we lose out on by not understanding His creation. It's like my computer. I have no idea how my computer works or how to get the most out of my computer. I know there are things in my computer, even my cell phone, that I probably will never understand, because all I want to do is see that it works, make a phone call, or type a letter or something like that, an email. I'm not that deep when it comes to electronics. But I know people that are, and they can get so much great use out of their electronic gadgets. I can barely use mine. I can maybe type an email, and maybe I can do an email, I can do a few things, but there's so much more in the computers and the cell phones than we know, am I right? I mean, some of you guys could probably give us weeks of lessons on how to use your phone and get the maximum out of your iPhone. If we deny your messages to us, if we don't listen to what you have to share, we are hurting ourselves. That's the point. That's the point. And that's what Paul is beginning to tell his people, that they have no excuse, because although they know who God is, they do not glorify Him as God or thank Him. On the contrary, they have become futile in their thinking, and their undiscerning hearts have become darkened. Claiming to be wise, they have become fools. In fact, they have exchanged the glory of the immortal God for mere images, like a mortal human being, or like birds, animals, reptiles, idols. This is plainly manifest, folks, in the way modern man has perverted his own conscience by rejecting God and God's ways. You reject God and God's creation, you're really missing the boat. So the challenge here is to pick up and learn more about the ways of God. And Paul starts his letter by telling the people there are many people who are way off base, and then he's going to go bring it around to know that there is hope in the Messiah. Thankfully, there is hope in the Messiah. Let me read a quick conclusion here from this other book on Romans. It's very helpful. Romans 2, which is coming up next week, will become clear in Romans 2, does issue some admonishing words against first century Jewish possession of the Torah, as though having the Torah's instructions somehow means that God will give His people some sort of special favors without having to follow it. That was a problem for the Jewish people in Rome. On the contrary, the Torah that Paul's fellow Jews possess condemns them for their failures just as much as it condemns the world at large. Hence, we're all sinners. But the answer is that through Yeshua the Messiah, there's a solution to all the problems that we have in our individual lives, as well as in the world situation, which I believe is getting worse and worse and worse. So look forward to learning more about this in Romans 2 next week. Let's stand now as we close our service by saying